Welcome to one and all. I'm here today with a very special guest, Vajra Regan. Vajra is a PhD student at the University of Toronto's Centre for Medieval Studies. He is the author of the Hermetic Origins of the Liber Sigillorum of Techel and the De Consecratione Lapidum, a previously unknown 13th-century version of the Liber Almandal Salomonis, newly introduced with a critical edition and translation. And today I'm hoping to have a discussion about his research into lapidaries and magic stones and their role in shaping the intellectual landscape of the medieval Latin West. Vajra and I met many moons ago at the International Congress for Medieval Studies in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which I try to attend on a yearly basis as a member of the Societas Magica and the research group on manuscript evidence. Vajra and I were also both recent speakers at the meeting of the RGME, and I thought it would be a good idea to get him here on the channel to discuss his research for a wider audience. Vajra, it's a pleasure to have you here with me today and to go through your research.
The pleasure is entirely mine. Thank you for having me on. And we've known each other for quite a while, actually. Unfortunately, because of recent events, we haven't actually had a chance to talk in person, but hopefully the next Congress, the Medieval Congress coming up in Kalamazoo, we can all get together and it should be fun. But it's great to be here, and thanks again for inviting me.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on. So let's jump right into it.
Sure.
So could you provide us with a brief overview of the role of lapidaries and magical stones in the medieval Latin West and how they were perceived in the context of magical, religious, and scientific thought?
Sure. There's a lot of misleading information about lapidaries. Basically, lapidaries were catalogs of stones, and they would describe various stones and their physical characteristics and their properties or virtues, which were very often marvelous or occult or magic and so forth. And on the surface, these texts don't seem very interesting. They're just books of stones. And I've been to quite a few conferences, academic conferences now, kind of shopping around different portions of my papers and the books I'm working on and so forth. And more than once, I've had a professor come up to me, sometimes from a very prestigious university, and pull me aside, during kind of cocktail hour and say, you really have a good understanding of Greek and Latin classics. Why are you wasting your time with these books of rocks? Just straight to my face. And he said, you could get a job immediately if you were just working on, this Greek and Latin stuff. And that just kind of shows you that, just how much people don't know about lapidaries, even within kind of the academic circles that we float around in, classics and medieval studies. But the lapidaries are very fascinating, and particularly in the late Middle Ages, because they're really books of amulets. And they describe, sometimes in great detail, the images to be engraved on stones and specific instructions for the types of ligatures or magic rings or necklaces that they should be set in, and the properties ascribed to these amulets. They run, all the way from the medical and therapeutic to dispelling demons, commanding demons, calling up spirits, use an aid for use in hydromancy or necromancy, all of these things. So it's an interesting situation because they're situated, like, in some ways kind of in this intersection of different knowledge disciplines. On the one hand, they seem to kind of trespass onto the domains of illicit magic, and yet this tradition was firmly established in the Middle Ages. And it was actually one of the most popular genres in the late Middle Ages. And we have all these great thinkers, the great scholastic encyclopedists, who write some of their most important stuff on lapidaries and just synthesizing all this material that they have both from the ancient world and the Latin tradition, but also the new texts that were being translated in the 12th century. And this is where it gets interesting, because the lapidaries were kind of the bridge between the primitive magic of the early Middle Ages and the learned magic, specifically the astral magic of the Arabs, introduced into the Latin West in the 12th century, right? So in the 12th century and the 13th century, you have all these texts on astral magic that talk about fashioning talismans under very precise astrological conditions. And this new learning really takes deep roots almost immediately in European intellectual culture, and particularly in medicine. So that by the end of the 13th century, you have, the universities of Bologna and Montpellier are actually offering courses on where they teach astral magic for healing. And you have all these great physicians like Arnold of Villanova, Peter of Abano, Bernard Gordon, Gentile da Foligno, who are all writing these tracts on astral magic in the use of healing. So there's kind of been a question as to why this particular magic, this learned magic, why Europeans were so receptive to it. Especially because it was coming from the Islamic kingdoms, and obviously there was no love lost between Christians and Muslims at that time. But they really grab on to this astral magic. And so there's been a lot of speculations as to why that just swept through the Latin West at that time. And part of the answer, a big part of the reason why that happened is because you had this entire established tradition of the lapidaries, this amuletic magic that was already deeply ingrained in European culture. And so that, as David Pingree says, and others have said, the lapidaries were kind of the pathway that led up to the grand threshold of the astral talisman. Now, my contribution to this is that it didn't just stop at the door, at the threshold to astral talismans. It went beyond that, and that the lapidaries were one of the prime vehicles for the dissemination of this knowledge throughout Western Europe. It was a way for Europeans to domesticate all these texts that were, some more than others were on the edge of orthodoxy, especially when you get into, the Almandal Salomonis and things like that. So they transmitted a lot of this, particularly the astral magic, but also these other texts of more ritual magic, Solomonic magic. And at the same time, they transformed it. And so they play a crucial role in what is often called the transformation of magic in the late Middle Ages, because there is a radical transformation that occurs in the 12th and 13th century that completely alters the course of Western esotericism and magic. And That has a lot to do, obviously, with the era of the translating activity in the 12th century. But a lot of those texts, this is the interesting thing too, a lot of those texts that were initially translated in the 12th century, they circulated widely particularly in Paris in the university circles in the early 13th century. And we have testimony from William of Auvergne, the Bishop of Paris, about this. And we can get into that later because William of Auvergne is a really interesting character. By the end of the 13th century, theologians get fed up with this in Paris, and there's just this kind of full-scale prescription, so that a lot of these texts only survive sometimes only in one manuscript that's highly corrupt and is very late, like 15th, 16th century. Well, it turns out that, in fact, a lot of these texts were assimilated into the lapidaries. And sometimes the lapidaries actually preserve better texts than, the actual original texts that survive in these late corrupt manuscripts. So the lapidaries offer a really unique window into a very early formative time in this transformation of magic.
So, how was the study and use of these lapidaries an important vessel for the Hermetic sciences specifically?
Yeah, so again, it gets back to the 12th century translating activity. And you already had a lot of stuff in the early lapidaries that is very similar to things that we find in texts of astral magic. So, they talk about amulets and engraving them with images. And sometimes there's kind of primitive astrological elements to them. It doesn't reach the heights of astral magic, but there's a lot of points of contact to that. So it was very easy to kind of fold the astral magic, the magic of these astral talismans, into the lapidaries and then spread them. And lapidaries were a big part of the culture at the time. So you could get away with a lot. You could really get away with a lot that you couldn't get away with normally in other genres. Lapidaries were, for a variety of reasons, partly because of their connection with medicine and so forth, partly with the scholastics and this attempt to come up with all these encyclopedias where they would classify and hyper-classify all knowledge, so they just gathered all this stuff together. Then also you have the whole debate between natural magic and obviously, the spiritual or demonic magic. And astral magic doesn't necessarily require a ritual element to it. And it can be explained in terms of natural causation. So if you read Al-Kindi or some of these other Arabic writers, they have this idea that, in fact, the talismans they receive their efficacy from the rays of the stars, which are completely natural. And then Albert the Great, the fantastic Dominican philosopher and theologian, he writes this treatise, the Liber Mineralium, the Book of Minerals, in which he actually provides, for the time, a very robust theory that explains the intrinsic and extrinsic virtues of stones, amulets, talismans in terms of natural causation. And again, he sees it as coming from the stars. So when there's this concatenation of rays that hit the stone at a particular time, particularly during its formation or when it's being engraved with an astrological image, so it channels those celestial influences. And he believes that the rays of the stars are completely natural. And you really have to kind of admire Albert the Great for his steadfast conviction that physics ought to be able to explain natural phenomena. Kind of like Roger Bacon, he really tries to fence off natural philosophy and says that everything in nature should be explicable within the system without appealing to spiritual entities or metaphysical entities and so forth. So astral magic had the advantage that it could be explained in terms of natural causation. Now, there were a lot of texts that add a ritual element to these things. And that's the critical distinction. And Albert and others warn about this. They're like, as long as there's no ritual element, you're not praying to the stars, there's no lighting of incense and orations to the spirits of the stars, no use of blood, that was a big thing, then you're good. It's only when it transgresses into ritual that then the idolatry comes into it. And there's always the lurking threat that demons will intervene and kind of trick the operator and say, oh no, I'm the one who's really operating all this up. I'm the one who's carrying out all these properties that are really the properties of the stones. So that was always a lingering danger within the medieval imagination.
So were they reading Moses Maimonides? Because Maimonides goes at length about this kind of dichotomy between natural magic and demonic magic in the Guide for the Perplexed. And usually the ritual is the difference between the demonic and the natural magic. So that idea is not, it wasn't born from Albertus Magnus. So
no, absolutely not. No, Albert got this all from from Arabic writers. He wasn't familiar with Al-Kindi's De Radius, but he was familiar with other Arabic thinkers who had expounded on this. And so he adapts that. He's not as good a philosopher in this area as Al-Kindi, but he is a Latin philosopher, so the fact that he endorses it and comes up with this very sophisticated and robust theory that, so he authorizes it for a Latin audience.
Right. Does he discuss Albertus Magnus, that is, characteres? So this idea that if you inscribe on the gem something, then it is a kind of hidden method of communication with demons, and it no longer is in the realm of natural magic, but sort of verges into the realm of demonic magic once you start engraving and inscribing a stone with something in order to communicate with these higher entities. Does he discuss this?
He does. He has quite a few chapters on this and discusses it at length. He didn't have a problem with engravings as long as the engravings were astrological. So if they were an engraving of the figure of a constellation or something, then he saw this as simply channeling the rays of the stars. It was a way of gathering them in, this kind of transference of power into
natural
the stone.
Sympathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So it was completely natural. So he didn't have a problem with that. Albert's an interesting character because he really kind of negotiates his way through all these landmines and stuff and chooses his words very carefully. And that's why he lived to like 80, 85 years old, whereas Peter of Urbano died in disgrace in jail and Arnold of Villanova was persecuted and all these other people. But there's a lot of stuff in there where it's not entirely consistent with his philosophy. And you kind of wonder, okay, well, maybe he was open to some of these other ideas, but this is speculation. But no, he didn't have a problem with engravings, with using, ligatures or suspensions, so rings or amulets or talismans, suspended from the neck, and so forth. Again, it was for him. It was only dangerous when that ritual element entered in. So
the kind of stuff that you find in Picatrix and in Ibn Washia and that sort of thing. Very detailed procedures on how to invoke planetary gods and draw them down into through a consecration of a talisman, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, he's clearly aware of a lot of that literature, and also his Liber Mineralium. So there's, I mean, most of it is this huge, massive natural philosophic text, but his writings on, amuletic stones, he has this big catalog of stones, the lapidary section that describes all the stones and these, marvelous virtues, magical virtues. And then all this huge section where he talks about astrological images and so forth. Those sections were frequently excerpted and compiled together with other texts of magic that were maybe more dubious from an orthodox standpoint. So a lot of people read this stuff without reading his philosophical explanations of it. So, and then that's why you get all these books, books on magic and amulets and so forth, attributed to Albert the Great in, the 14th and later centuries. So,
yeah, there's so many pseudepigraphically attributed works to Albertus Magnus.
Yeah, I mean, he reaches that status of Hermes or Apollonius of Tyana or one of these people, somebody that scribes would reach for when they needed an authority to legitimize a particular text or so forth. So you have all this pseudepigrapha circulating under Albert's name.
So what was the perception of this kind of learned magic in the universities at the time? The universities are kind of new development in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. They start popping up around Europe. And so how does magic fit into this? And also, how did Albertus Magnus define magic if he made a distinction between two kinds?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky question. That gets into a deep area. All right, so taking the universities. So the universities really arise in the 13th century. Before that, you have the cathedral schools and stuff. But in the 13th century, you really get universities in the way that we think of universities. And I found it's very hard to generalize about this. Attitudes would fluctuate and change over time, and geography. So in the beginning of the 13th century, again, a lot of these texts seem to be circulating freely at least among students and masters. Then you go through this period of controversy, and then they kind of creep back in. Again, I'm talking about the University of Paris here and stuff. But like I said, it never really goes away. And because of the perceived benefits of this in medicine, it really, that becomes a major impetus for establishing this because nobody likes to be sick, And then you have a situation like the University of Bologna. Now, Julian Veronese has done a lot of interesting work on this, where he's kind of identified Bologna as a locus for this resurgence of what many scholars are now calling Christian theurgy or angel magic. And this is where you have the really grand volumes, the grand manuscripts of the Ars Notoria popping up, and the Liber Almandal. So you get these big, glossed versions of the Liber Almandal of Solomon. In the same way that you would get, these glossed versions of the Bible, like the Glossa Ordinaria. So you would have the text block in the center, and then completely framed by very detailed commentary that would go through and explain the text. And the commentary is longer than the text. And then plus, all just the fantastic illustrations. The most beautifully illustrated version of the Ars Notoria comes from, the University of Bologna and stuff. And a lot of other texts. Like I said, they were teaching astral magic at the university in medicine. So this was clearly an area where this stuff just flourished in the open. And that kind of challenges the view of previous scholars that magic was an underground activity, is a marginal activity. Well, the picture is more complicated than that. Yeah, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. All of this stuff is contextual. And that's one thing I've really learned is the danger of generalizing about these things. Any text has to be contextualized and recontextualized in order to understand. Because there is a plurality of views about these things.
So, what did the Dominicans and Franciscans have to do with all this? These are mendicant orders. They are dedicated to apostolic poverty and preaching. They are associated at times with the Inquisition. But then at the same time, they are the people writing about this stuff and sometimes promulgating it in many respects. So, what's the deal with that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, the Dominicans and the Franciscans are very fascinating. You have somebody like Albert the Great. Well, Albert the Great, Dominican, if I remember correctly, he's the only person in the 13th century to actually be called great in his own lifetime. That's how much respect he commanded, and deservedly so in a lot of ways. And then you have Roger Bacon, Franciscan, in many ways very similar to Albert in his interest in nature and science and trying to kind of fence these things off from quote unquote superstition. But it's interesting. Right away you see a split between their attitudes towards this stuff. So Albert really is a proponent of astrology and astral magic. And he doesn't like alchemy. He thinks that the instruments are just not sophisticated enough to allow for these processes. Roger Bacon takes the exact opposite view. He's interested in alchemy, and he thinks that the instruments for astrology are not sophisticated enough to be able to make these kind of predictions. And even then, even if they did have advanced instruments, he's not really sure. He has a lot of questions about astrology. So he tends to denigrate astrology and promote alchemy. So right away, you have this kind of conflict between the two orders. These orders attract the brightest people at that time. So you have all these really great thinkers all joining the Franciscans or the Dominicans. But at the same time, there's a lot of internal conflict, both within each order and then between the orders and so forth. And then you have the whole controversy with the radical Franciscans and the Joachim prophecies and so forth, and so-called spiritual Franciscans. And so then the Dominicans kind of rise up, being the guardians of the faith, the Lord's dogs. But I'm not a huge proponent of network theory, but I think it would be interesting to map the networks of the people around Albert the Great and Roger Bacon. Albert the Great was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas and probably the teacher of Thomas of Canterbury. obviously Thomas Aquinas, one of the most important figures. Thomas of Canterbury, also very influential in his own way in kind of spreading these books of amulets or lapidary texts. Then, with the Franciscans, you have all these people around Roger Bacon and, all the books that he wrote. And there's a lot of evidence that many of these texts were because they were mendicants, so they weren't cloistered, they would travel to all these areas and take with them the manuscripts and stuff. So, they had all these networks to disseminate these things.
Right. It's just interesting because we think of lapidaries as these books of precious and semi-precious stones. And yet we have the mendicants who are dedicated to apostolic poverty in many ways, although that wanes as the 13th century goes on, and they come to terms with the idea that you can own property communally, just not individually. But these are books about precious stones, jewelry, that sort of thing. And you got to ask yourself, like, what does a friar dedicated to apostolic poverty have to do with precious gems and jewels and metals and all of this stuff when they can't even touch money or own anything individually?
Well, I believe in the case of Albert the Great and a lot of these guys, their interest was in the use of these precious stones as a type of technology, something that could benefit humanity and well-being, particularly in the realms of medicine, but also in these other areas. And that was their interest. I don't think they were so much interested in, just having these as emblems of authority. Some did, some certainly did, but they were more interested in understanding them theoretically and how they could be used to improve human well-being and so forth.
Right.
So
for Roger Bacon, a lot of it had to do with bolstering the health of individual Christians to strengthen Christendom in order for it to be empowered against the rise of Antichrist, which in his mind was really the rise of Islam. And we are in the age of the Crusades, and Christendom is embattled on all sides, and so it makes sense that. And you also get, like you mentioned, the prophecies of Joachim of Fior and the impending rise of Antichrist and all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of these sciences fit into this apocalyptic or millenarian mold as a way of.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, because a lot of these books, I suspect, were written as a way of inspiring devotion by drawing attention to the wonders in God's creation. So I think that had a lot to do with it too. And I should point out that despite all the fancy theories that you get from people like Albert the Great, and there used to be a lot of talk, particularly by previous generations of scholars, who fixated on what they perceived as this very skeptical attitude in Albert the Great's writings. And his favorite words are, like expertus sum and so forth, So it has been proven, or I have proven, or I have seen. In fact, he didn't see most of the stuff that he claimed to. And in some senses, it's just kind of a cultural difference about the way they talk about things. So I don't want to say that Albert was a liar. It's just he proved it in the sense that, well, the authorities said it, so that was proof. If
within a scholastic model, that's good enough.
Exactly. So to get back to the main point, most of the authors of the Lapidaries in the Middle Ages had no practical experience with stones. And this gets into another problem, which is the whole Latin mineralogical vocabulary. there was really no consensus on what these words meant. So the Latin word smaragdus is almost universally translated as emerald. But in fact, smaragdus could designate a whole variety of green stones. And then plus they inherited this tradition, this classical tradition, from authors such as Pliny the Elder, who wrote the huge encyclopedia, the Historia Naturalis, the natural history. He talks about all these stones and stuff. And a lot of the words are Greek loan words or cognates. And this tradition comes down to the late Middle Ages in a very corrupt state. The names have all been corrupted, conflated. You have all these accretions of fables and myths and stuff. And so they just kind of pick and choose among this. They don't really understand it. They don't really verify any of this through observation. And it's very perplexing. And we still don't really understand a lot of the methods that they used or what they were thinking of when they sometimes it seems like they just combine accounts ad hoc, They were scientific. You start to see this kind of trend, this scientific trend, even though they maybe weren't thinking about it on a discursive level. But just the fact that they were trying to classify and hyper-classify these things, and that's where science begins, with definitions and then categories and then the building of taxonomies. And then you get to like, okay, well, let's actually observe and look at this stuff, But that was only much later.
It was not as taxonomically clean cut as when you have Linnaeus. And then even Linnaeus, you're still going to have a century before you get to more modern taxonomical systems.
And there's a huge, prior to the development of crystallography, there was really no accurate test for distinguishing between a lot of these gems. And that's very different from the situation that we find with gold and silver. The reason gold becomes currency, the universal currency, is because there was a very easy method for testing its purity. You had the touchstone. And you could right away, you just rub the touchstone against the gold. And not only could you tell if it was fake or not, but you could actually get a pretty good idea of the purity. So that's why gold becomes the standard. But there were no such tests for the vast majority of gems. And Pliny complains about this. He says the greatest fraud perpetrated against the society is a gem trade. So, and he talks at length about all the forgeries and so forth. And Albert talks about this as well. So I think people are aware of it.
And that's a big part in the early days of alchemy as well, is the creation of glasses and gems and making trinkets for people who are visiting Egypt and tourists and things like that who can't necessarily tell the difference between different stones and glasses and substances.
Oh, no, they couldn't. And there was all kinds of we have all kinds of recipe books that talk about how to dye glass in various ways to make it look like certain gems, how to create fake pearls or costume jewelry. So there was a lot of that going on.
I'm reminded, while we're on the topic of taxonomical primitiveness, I suppose, one of the stones in Picatrix is sort of like this smaragdina you're talking about. This emerald can be all kinds of green stones. You get Feyrizek, which is a stone dedicated to Saturn, and sometimes it's turquoise, sometimes it's sapphire. And so there's no clear knowledge of which one it is. It's just a blue stone, right? So
yes, well, the word sapphire, sapphirus, which is where we get our modern English term sapphire. So sapphirus actually used to designate what we now call lapis lazuli or azurite. So in most cases prior to the late Middle Ages, that's what That's what they mean by sapphirus. Then in the Middle Ages, they get introduced to lapis lazuli, which is actually, well, it's part Latin, part Arabic word. And then so you have these kind of all this confusion between sapphirus and lapis lazuli that eventually gets straightened out. Now I suspect that in the Begatrix, they're probably referring to lapis lazuli, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I haven't looked into it.
Yeah, I mean, it just says Feyerzeck, and some have interpreted it as sapphire, and others as turquoise, and I think across different geographic regions, it has different identifications. It's the one stone that's used for life extension. So you also find it in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, which he's getting it from the Begatrix, but it's for Saturn, for a ring of life extension that's dedicated to Saturn.
Yeah, it's possible that Pliny was aware of sapphire in a modern sense, but they didn't have the technology to refine it or engrave it. And that really doesn't come about in the Latin West until, I think fairly late. I'm not sure about, in the Islamic kingdoms, they may have been ahead of the curve on this in terms of being actually able to engrave sapphire and things like that. But I know in the second book, in the 10th chapter of the second book of the Begatrix, it starts out by really just talking about the colors of the stones that relate to each of the planets and so forth. So, and green is frequently associated with life and extending life.
Right.
Or green and blue. So, yeah.
So, this book that you've worked closely with, the Liber Sigillorum of Techel, what is that, and who is Techel, and what is the significance of this particular book?
Oh, this is such a huge and complex question. I'll try and give the basics of it. Okay, basically, it's another book of amulets. There is some mystery that is far from being resolved at present as to whether this text was originally one text or 2. David Pingery was convinced that it was actually 2 texts, and he distinguished them by the names the Liber Sigillorum of Techel and the De Lapidibus of King Azarius. And there is a clear division kind of in the text, in the earliest manuscripts, the best manuscripts. So the Liber Sigillorum describes it, sometimes in great detail, the images on specific stones. And the images are very similar to the types of images that we encounter in what they used to call the Gnostic amulets, the magic amulets found in Egypt and so forth. And some of them are really phantasmagoric. And their astrological significance is not readily apparent, particularly to people in the Latin West at that time who were unfamiliar with the Arabic traditions and so forth. So they seem very pagan and bizarre. And so they tell you the gem, and then it tells you the specific image to be engraved on the gem. And then there's all these instructions for actually fabricating the ligature, which is almost always a magic ring. So it'll tell you that, the ring has to be made of gold or silver, should be 12 times the weight of the stone. And then it'll tell you, the various, the herbs and plants and animal matter that are to be secreted under the gem. So the blood of the hopo and, all the classic, ones we encounter. And then it gives this long list of the magical properties. And these can extend from therapeutic values such as curing fever, getting rid of cataracts, and then it goes to the more fantastic invisibility, dispelling demons, commanding demons, all those kinds of things. The De Lapidibus of Azarius, it's very similar in the way, in its composition and the introductory formula, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But the chief difference is that the stone is of no consequence. What's important is the image on the stone, and the images are all recognizable as images of the Ptolemaic figures of the constellations. So you have the archer Sagittarius engaged in combat with, Scorpio. You have Andromeda and Perseus and all these. These are all very recognizable figures. And that was somewhat more acceptable to people. There was some doubt about the legitimacy of Techel because a lot of people didn't recognize the astrological significance of these images. Now, again, whether these were, clearly they seem to come from two different sources, but that doesn't mean that it could be that a 12th century editor just combined these into what became the Liber Sigillorum. And the title De Lapidibus of King Azarius was really an unfortunate choice by Pingree, because King Azarius is only mentioned in the prologues of 3 very late manuscripts. It's clearly an edition that is based on the previous prologue by Techel, but we're all now kind of stuck with the terminology. And we have to call it something. So
the most generic title you could possibly conceive of.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the interesting thing about these texts, and one reason that they were so successful, is that they actually never tell the reader to engrave the images himself. So these are supposed to be images already engraved on the stones. And it gives this kind of backstory or origin story that says that these were images that were originally engraved by the ancient Israelites during the Exodus. And so it presents itself as a kind of field manual for identifying these stones. So if you happen to find a stone with an image on it, and so you can pull out your handy book of Techel, look through and see, oh, yeah, it corresponds to this image, so it's legitimate, Now, interestingly, the rings are to be constructed by the operator. That was okay. But it was really the graven images thing and the prohibition against that worried people. And this found a kind of a way around that.
Just like you shall not make a graven image. So you just find the graven image and then it's okay.
Yeah. But that was actually very common because in the 12th century, they really didn't have the technology still to make those kind of engravings. And they would actually, it sounds incredible, but actually, they would find these things all the time. I remember reading about a farmer in Paris in the late 19th century who dug up just this huge treasure of ancient Roman artifacts, and this huge statue of Mercury that was just lying under the ground. So that must have happened routinely in the Middle Ages. And these engraved gems were highly prized by, obviously, the lords and the secular clergy because it was an emblem of power. It connected them back to the Roman Empire. and helped legitimize their claims to power and stuff. So, but yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. So each entry starts out, if you should happen to find this stone with an image on it, then. But it gets even more bizarre than that and interesting. David Pingree really led. I love David Pingree, and he's contributed so much to our field. And I mean, I'm fully cognizant that if I manage to see just a little bit farther in this very narrow channel, it's only because I've been able to stand on his broad shoulders and stuff.
Myself included, yeah.
Nevertheless, it must be said that he really led generations of scholars astray in regards to Liber Sigillorum, because he believed that it was based on, it was a Latin translation of a late antique Greek exemplar. And I mean, he was such a towering figure in this field and knew so much about Greek and Arabic and so forth. Pretty much everybody just accepted that. Caitlin Mesler was really the first to notice that a lot of the images, some of the images were identical to those in the Begotrix, and many more were very similar. Not only the images, but the whole procedure about constructing the rings, and there were lots of other points of contact. So she was the first to theorize that maybe their origins lied in the Arabic Hermetic literature. Now, keep in mind, the Begotrix wasn't introduced to the Latin West until, like the mid 13th century. But I think what it was like 1258.
1256, yeah.
1256 to 1258 or 9 or something. The Liber Sigillorum dates to the 12th century. So obviously, these images couldn't have been copied from the Begotrix. Now, Mesler never really follows up on this, and it just kind of remains this mystery. It's like, well, okay, yeah, they are similar, but why? And as it turns out, we were able to find the text from which they were copied, and there was a whole group of Arabic Hermetica that were translated in the mid 12th century and included such works as the Liber Planetarum or Liber Saturni of Hermes, of course, the Stations of the Cult of Venus, the best title ever. Actually, a lot of books on Venus. I mean, you have the Liber Veneris, so the Book of Venus, a whole bunch of others. And they all kind of describe similar things, which is the construction of these talismans and magic rings. And so we were able to identify the Liber Planetarum as the text from which the oldest version of Techel had been adapted. So the oldest version of Techel, which dates to the 12th century, so probably not long after the Liber Planetarum was translated. So the Liber Sigillorum took the Latin translation and just extracted all this material from it and put it in this form that was kind of acceptable to Christians. Now, if you look at the original Liber Planetarum, there's very detailed instructions about the precise astrological conditions under which, the ring is to be engraved, or the stone is to be engraved, and the ring is to be made, and so forth. So it does fall into that category of astral magic. All those kind of and it also includes a lot of ritual instructions, very detailed in terms of the clothing that's to be worn, the songs that are to be sung, and it gives precise recipes for the types of incense to be concocted for each of the planets, and so forth. So the Liber Sigillorum kind of gets rid of all that. And again, it hints at these astrological doctrines, but they're not really presented. So yeah, so that's the connection, really. It takes all this stuff from the Arabic text of astral magic and reformulates them, and then they spread throughout Europe. And most people seem to have never even made the connection to astrology. And Thomas of Canterbury seems to be completely ignorant that these texts are astrological. Or if he was aware of it, he doesn't say anything about it. I think there were people who did recognize the astrological component in them and then actually re-assimilate them into astral magic. And I suspect that at least some of these people were aware of the connection to the Liber Planetarum. And so Albert might have been, it's not entirely clear. Peter of Abano, who was widely read in this literature. So there were people who recognized the astrological elements and connected it with these other texts of astral magic that have been translated and disseminated throughout the Latin West.
So who's Techel?
Yeah, nobody really knows. One theory put forward by Thorndike is that it was kind of a corruption of Zale, the famous Jewish astrologer.
Ibn Bishr.
Exactly. Yeah, very good. That's possible. It's never really been proven.
Aben Teclis?
Oh, and then another theory was that it's a corruption of the name of the famous engraver of gems, who I think is briefly mentioned in Exodus. I can't remember his name, but so he's the one who I think fashioned a lot of the gems for Aaron's breastplate and
Old Testament Baal Shem Tov type guy.
Yeah, but nobody really knows where the name Techel comes from. Again, and here, I hate to keep going off on David Pingree, but Pingree was kind of the one who established Techel as the form of the name, which we all use. But the earliest manuscripts have Sale or Kale or Chael. And so forth. So, yeah. but who he was supposed to be is not really clear. In the prologue, he simply says that he was one of the Israelites, one of the ancient Israelites who was part of the Exodus. And then he says that he was selected out of everybody to choose the stones that were to be used in the breastplate of the high priest Aaron and in the liturgical paraphernalia. And it's interesting, there's some ambiguity in the prologues. There's lots of different prologues about Techel that circulate with slightly different details. Some are longer than others. In some cases, it's not entirely clear whether the ancient Israelites actually carved these or whether somehow they received these engravings from the impression of the stars or just directly from God.
Or took them from the Egyptians.
This is really the bizarre thing. So it says that these images were formed or fashioned according to the course and movements of the constellations of planets. And then you have this epilogue, which is really bizarre, which says that the ancient Israelites took all these stones and had them consecrated by Chaldean priests in a temple of Apollo. So, I mean, there's clearly different traditions and prologues that have been adapted here and so forth. So, yeah. I mean, nobody really knows who Techel is. He's this kind of, I guess, pseudepigraphic figure that this text is ascribed to, just like Azarias. Sometimes you find the text ascribed to Ptolemy in some late manuscripts and stuff, but the earliest manuscripts all attributed to this mysterious figure, Zahel. Right. So,
I mean, Zahel makes sense to me, but I might be biased because Zahel, or Saul ibn Bishr, makes up, he's like the main source, or at least one of the main sources in this work that I'm working on, the Hermetic book of the Six Principles of Things. And so all of the astrological stuff is drawn directly from Zahel, or Saul, and I could see how Zahel, with the that, I don't know what you would call it, dentalized Z, would sound like Techel or Techel.
Yes, and it's been noticed that in many manuscripts, and particularly many early manuscripts, the Liber Sigillorum travels with texts of Zahel. So very frequently you'll have the astrological works or astronomical works of Zahel, and then it'll be followed by the Liber Sigillorum,
Yeah.
So they may have drawn some connection there. Zahel definitely wasn't the author of this text, but it's plausible why they may have made that connection.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So what is the stations of the cult of Venus then? And what about the Book of Venus? Is the Book of Venus related to the Book of Saturn, or are they versions of the same text? Or
the Stations of the Cult of Venus is such a fascinating text. So it's another one of these works that is translated in the 12th century. And again, kind of like these other works, it's really about fashioning all these various talismans under, precise astrological conditions. But I mean, there is a huge ritual component to this. And it's interesting that these rituals are not just a lone practitioner. I mean, you have the main operator or magician or whatever you want to call him. And then he has his entire retinue, and it talks about, and they're all dressed, they all have to dress in the costumes appropriate to the specific deity whose stellar influence they're trying to draw down. And here it gets into a really fuzzy kind of thing, because it seems like what they're talking about is not just, these kind of natural stellar rays, but the actual spirits of the planets and stuff. And there's orations to the planets, very long orations. And it actually describes an entire liturgy, an astral liturgy of the planets. And it's kind of funny, for example. So you have blacksmith or artisan who is fashioning the ring. He also has to be dressed in the costume of the planet. And there's various instructions about how, there should be this chorus behind him singing funeral songs or some other type of songs. And then you even have, so if it's a ring of Venus, then everybody has to dress as Venus. Keep in mind, these are all men. I just have this image of this burly blacksmith dressed up as Venus, hammering on this ring while this chorus of men in dresses are singing funeral songs or whatever songs of Venus. It's a really fascinating text. It only survives in one late manuscript, and it's never been published or edited in any form.
Do you have plans on doing that? Because that sounds fascinating. Just another thing on the list.
I want to be the editor of that text so bad, but I'm sure somebody else is either working on it or is
just say you're working on it, and then nobody else will touch it.
Well, Vittoria Perona Capani was supposed to release, as part of the Hermes Latinus series, critical editions of all these texts. She announced this back in 1999. And I love her. I mean, she is the person to do this, but it's been 25 years now, basically, since the announcement of that book. And I can't help but think that research in this area was kind of slowed down because everybody was awaiting this book. And it was announced again and again by Brett Poles. And then it disappeared from the Brett Poles catalog. But shortly after I published this last article with Lauri Aukenstrom, I found out that she's actually still planning to release this book. So she's probably going to be, she probably will. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing our thing with Brett Poles, the Hermes Latinus stuff, and it's been 3 or 4 years since we announced that we were working on it, and we're still hacking away at it just because it's so painstakingly laborious and everything needs to be perfect. And
these texts are so complicated. I in defense of Perona Capani, I understand why it took 25 years.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to have a knowledge of the Arabic tradition, the Latin tradition, the Greek tradition. And then plus some of these manuscripts are preserved in, like I said, just one or two really corrupt manuscripts that are extremely difficult to read.
Or inaccessible or difficult to reach, like hidden away in some library in another country that is not immediately accessible.
Yes. Yeah. But the Hermes Latinus project is great, and I'm really looking forward to other publications in that series.
Yeah, that really is a great series. I mean, our work that we're doing right now for it is the new edition of the Asclepius, and also the Book of Six Principles of Things. And there's also a commentary on the Asclepius called the Glossae Super Trismegistrum.
I'm really interested in reading that. Yeah.
Yep. And a commentary on the Book of 24 Philosophers and a set of commentaries on the Book of 24 Philosophers. So it's going to be all of those.
These are English translations.
So they have already been published in
that's what I thought.
By Cetini and Udry.
They're the people who really know that stuff. Yeah.
And so we're doing the kind of English translation that brings together all of those editions into a version that people who don't read Latin can read. And it's really looking to the aspect of Hermetica that is medieval. It is about the reception in the Middle Ages more so than it is about the inception of these particular texts.
That's so important because for so long these texts have been, well, first they were just locked away in these manuscripts, and then finally we started having critical editions. But I mean, these were very scholarly editions in Latin, which sometimes was very difficult to read. So they were not accessible to undergraduates and even to most graduate students. And consequently, you have this very fascinating area of medieval history, of Western history, not just Western history, but, it just intersects with all these other areas. And it's such a rich field. So by providing English translations, it really make these texts more accessible to students, also scholars. And I mean, there's so many different. I mean, one can approach this from so many different areas. So it's of interest to people in philosophy, art history, comparative literature, history of magic, on and on and on and on. So
yeah, it's just it's like a knot, and there are so many different ropes that are gathered together in one kind of node, and it's worth translating them because not everybody who works in all of these different areas, like art history and things like that, necessarily deal with the languages. People who deal specifically with magic don't necessarily deal with the languages. And so by making good scholarly translations of these, you're opening all of that scholarship from those Latin editions up to the world. Because like we're going to have very similar apparatus to what you can find in these Hermes Latinus, these little red books that they've put out. It's just that it'll be more accessible to people.
That's a really great project. And when you start looking at these texts, they really highlight the interconnections not only between the Latin West and the Islamic kingdoms, but then the continuity of the classical tradition in both cultures.
Yes.
It really explains a lot. It opens up all these areas. There's like, oh, okay, now I'm starting to see the picture.
Yeah, it's not just like there were Greeks and then there were Romans and then there were Arabs and then there were medieval people. It's like you can actually see the trajectory of these texts moving through each of these cultures, and the words that are being translated and those that are simply being transliterated, and which concepts are being borrowed and which concepts are being modified. And it's not just a story of transmission, but of transformation throughout centuries. So it's really interesting to see that in motion, because it's not just this. There's no purpose to purity spiraling and trying to get to the original text necessarily, because the original text is so different from what is handed down hundreds of years later and has passed through multiple translations and adaptations and changes. And these are living traditions. They're not just static.
Exactly.
I mean, in the Renaissance, they want them to be static. Guys like Pico della Mirandola will read a text like this and be like, Aristotle never wrote about magic stones or whatever. So all of this stuff, just throw it out. We can just go and read Aristotle in the Greek, and everything else you can ignore.
Or they want to get back to this pristine wisdom of the original Hermetica that inspired Plato and all these people. And exactly. So you have both sides of it.
Yeah, and like that is an interesting project, but it ignores centuries of development and change and evolution and conversation across cultures, and that really helps you flesh out the history of the interaction between all of these different peoples. So it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor in my books.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're exactly right about the importance of transformation in this. That each culture kind of adds its own thing, transforms it and domesticates it. But at the same time, I mean, there's this interesting dialectic between transformation and continuity, because certain things do remain the same, and are passed down over and over again, very often reinterpreted, but still you can see the connection, like where this came from.
And it's also worth looking at where things are subtracted, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole birth of the division between natural magic and demonic magic, comes from, we're going to keep this part, but we're going to throw this part out. And I suppose that reaches its kind of apogee in Francis Yates' thesis that Hermeticism is at the birth of science, which of course isn't entirely true, but there is something to be said about that.
There is something to be said about that, but she maybe pushes it a little bit too far. But
science is cumulative, it's gradual, and
iterative.
part of that accumulation was like sifting out what was naturally powerful versus what was demonically powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to turn now to something that you brought up at the RGME conference, which was just fascinating to me, and I know is fascinating to you, and that is this figure of Jupiter enthroned in the lapidary of Alfonso the Wise, Alfonso X. Could you elaborate on this connection between this image of Jupiter and the Olympian Zeus, as we know it from ancient Greece?
This is a really good segue because it ties into everything that we've just been talking about in terms of transformation, but also continuity. And yeah, it's a really fascinating story. And God, I wish I could claim credit for having been the one who first noticed it. But I believe John Sesnick in the transformation of the pagan gods was the first to notice it. So yes, getting back to Alfonso X, the Wise, obviously a huge patron of learning, and he had this royal scriptorium that is famous because it's where all these very important astronomical and astrological Arabic texts were translated into Castilian and then into Latin and then spread to the rest of the world. And of course, it's where the Gayat al-Hakim becomes translated as the Begotrix. And then you have this lapidary, so the lapidario of King Alfonso X, which is considered to be the preeminent lapidary of the Middle Ages and one of just the finest kind of manuscripts in terms of just its layout and its illustrations. And so just very lavishly illustrated. Unfortunately, not all of the illustrations were completed. And I say it's the preeminent lapidary of the Middle Ages. In fact, it didn't exert that much influence beyond Spain. But nevertheless, in terms of just the synthesis of all this Arabic knowledge together with Greek and Latin, the Greek and Latin authorities, and then just the design where you have all the illustrations and stuff. And it incorporates quite a bit from the Begotrix. So in the second book, 10th chapter, which is really the chapter dedicated to astrological talismans that are made from stones and are engraved and put into various magic rings and so forth. So it incorporates an image from that section, and the image is a description variously called, Jupiter enthroned or Zeus enthroned. And the great thing about the lapidario, it actually has an illustration of this image. The illustration is described in great detail in the text. And it says that, it has Jupiter carried on, he's on this throne that's carried by 4 angels with wings, and he has a crown or halo, as it was reinterpreted, and his arms are in the classic position like this, which actually goes back to the Greeks, but it was undoubtedly interpreted in different ways at that time. So we have the Begotrix. This same image also occurs in the Liber Sigillorum, which may have been the source of this in the Begotrix, or it might be related to another text that was used by the Begotrix. There's still a lot of research to do on this. So anyway, this image actually has a very long history. So if we go all the way back to 5th century BC ancient Greeks, So there's a famous sculptor, Pheidias, who's the most brilliant, esteemed sculptor in the classical world. And he's commissioned to build this statue of Zeus at the Temple of Zeus in Olympia. And he builds this monumental statue. It's actually considered one of the seven wonders of the classical or the ancient world. And the statue depicts Zeus on a throne, and the throne is carried by four victories, or Nike, to use the Greek name. So she was the goddess of victory and crowns and wreaths, and she has these wings and so forth. So Jupiter, or Zeus, is being carried on his throne by these four victories, and he has, the crown or wreath, and he's carrying a scepter, and one of his emblems, the eagle. Unfortunately, this statue was destroyed, but images of it are preserved on numerous coins. And most importantly, Pausanias, in his descriptions of Greece, which was written in the 2nd century AD, actually visited the temple and gives a very detailed firsthand description of this statue. Now, when you match these images up side by side, you see instantly that the four angels carrying Jupiter in the Lapidario are really the four Nikes with their wings. And it's the same image of Jupiter carried on the spear, and all the iconography and so forth. In some versions, his wreath or crown has been transformed into a halo. But actually, in the older texts, it's specifically described as a crown or a circulus. So, yeah, again, talking about the continuity of these images, I mean, you can draw a direct line from the 5th century and this image of Olympian Zeus created by Pheidias, who was probably working on even older models of Zeus, but his was the most famous. So you can trace a trajectory all the way from the 5th century BC Greece all the way up to the Beatrix and then the Lapidario.
Yeah, that's amazing. We don't find many things like that. So the fact that there is that connection is quite amazing. Do we know what the virtue of that image is? What it's an image for?
If I remember correctly, it's so the texts are somewhat confused about the type of stone, but it's basically the stones that are associated with Jupiter. So white, silver kinds of stones or clear stones. As far as the virtues, they're pretty much what you would expect from a ring of Jupiter. So power, authority,
victory, and trying to petition a king, something like that.
Yes.
Victory in a lawsuit, something like that.
Oh yeah, the whole litany of virtues. Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah, and this is in the Liber Planetarum, which again might have been the source of this image in the Beatrix. It is presented as kind of the first and preeminent ring of Jupiter.
Awesome. Well, that's all that I wanted to cover. That goes through all the questions that I wanted to ask you. So, Vajra, I wanted to thank you for coming on, and I'm sure
this has been fantastic.
My audience will love this discussion. And if they want to hear more of you, you were also recently on the Glitch Bottle podcast with Alexander F.
I was, yes.
And you discussed, I think, a fairly different set of questions. There were some overlapping topics, but I tried to make the questions a little bit different so that we weren't treading the same ground. So if people want to hear more of you, they can go and listen to that interview. Also, where else can people find some of your work? You have an academia.edu page, if I'm not mistaken, with your articles on it.
I would love to post the articles on there, but I don't know if you've had this experience with brepols. They're very proprietary.
I haven't, because I haven't had anything published yet. It's just a process.
Okay, so so I'm kind of under contract with them, so I haven't been able to publish. Haven't been able to post anything yet to academia. And brepols has been very good to me, and they've really gone the distance to. When I did the critical edition of this version of the Almandal, I mean, they're one of the few publishers that will do the real classical apparatus criticus, where it's under the text and stuff. And as opposed to so many publishers now where you have to flip either to the end notes, or they just seem to use Microsoft Word footnoting. So, there's like a little bit of text at the top and then just a row of footnotes, and it becomes really messy. So they tend to do an excellent job in terms of formatting and are still committed to that. But people can actually order the article through the brepols website, and you can just order the single article. And I think it's $20, but it's I think it's like over 100 pages.
Right. It's certainly worth it if you're into Solomonic magic and really a diehard in reading the texts and things like that.
Yeah. And it comes with a lot of translations of the Liber Planetarum and the Liber Sigillorum. There's long parts of it that are really pedantic if you're not seriously into this. So I want to be honest about what people can expect, before they pay their $20. But if you're deep into it and you want to take a look at the Liber Planetarum and the Liber Sigillorum, check it out. So
wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much, Vajra.
Always a pleasure.
Yes, it was great catching up, and I hope to see you again at the Kalamazoo conference in May.
Looking forward to it. Should be fun. Sounds like the whole gang's going to be there.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. So
All
have
right.
a great day, and I will see you later.
Thanks again for having me on.